There's a gravestone in a forgotten cemetery outside of Tombstone, Arizona. Weathered by decades of desert wind and scorching sun, that bears a name most people have never heard. Jackson, Silent Jack McCrae. The epitaph is simple, almost mocking in its brevity. He kept his secrets. What that cold stone doesn't tell you, what the history books conveniently omit, what even the most dedicated Wild West scholars have failed to uncover, is that this man survived 11 bullets across 3 separate gunfights, walked away from each one, and never once explained how he managed to do it. Not to the doctors who treated him, not to the lawmen who questioned him, not even to his own family in his final moments. This isn't a story about a famous gunslinger whose name echoes through history alongside Billy the Kid or Jesse James. This is something far more unsettling, a mystery wrapped in gunpowder and blood that has confounded everyone who's ever stumbled across the scattered fragments of Jackson McCrae's impossible life. And before we're done here, you're going to understand why his silence might have been the most terrifying part of his entire story. The first documented shooting happened on a scorching July afternoon in 1878 in a saloon that no longer exists in what used to be the copper mining town of Bisby, Arizona territory. Jackson McCrae was 23 years old, a drifter who'd been working odd jobs around the mining camps, keeping to himself mostly, earning a reputation as a man who could fix just about anything mechanical, but who never said more than absolutely necessary to get the job done. Witnesses later testified that Jackson had been sitting at a corner table, nursing a whiskey and reading a worn copy of Plutarch's Lives, which itself was unusual enough for a working cowboy in that time and place. 3 men walked in, and if you've heard enough stories about the Old West, you know exactly what happened next, or at least you think you do. These weren't random troublemakers looking for entertainment. They were the Gatlin brothers, Simon, Robert, and the youngest, Thomas, who'd been terrorizing smaller mining operations throughout southern Arizona for the better part of 2 years, shaking down workers, stealing payrolls, and leaving behind just enough violence to keep people afraid, but not quite enough to warrant a serious territorial manhunt. Simon Gatlin didn't appreciate the contradiction. He was a man whose authority depended on fear, and fear required consistent follow-through. He drew his revolver, a Colt single-action army that several people noticed was already cocked before it cleared the holster, and he fired 3 times at Jackson McCrae from a distance of maybe 12 feet. All 3 shots hit. The first bullet struck Jackson in the left shoulder, spinning him partially out of his chair. The second caught him high in the chest, just below the collarbone on the right side. The third, fired as Jackson was falling, hit him in the abdomen, slightly to the left of center. These weren't grazing wounds or near misses. The town doctor, a competent if overworked man named Dr. Herbert Calloway, later documented all 3 entry wounds with detailed sketches that still exist in the Cochise County Historical Archives. At that range, with those shot placements, Jackson McCrae should have been dead before he hit the floor, or, at the very least, incapacitated and bleeding out in a matter of minutes. Every single person in that saloon expected to watch a man die. But here's where the story stops making sense in ways that still provoke arguments among historians and ballistics experts who've studied the case. Jackson didn't stay down. According to 14 separate witness testimonies given to the territorial marshal over the following week, testimonies that remained remarkably consistent despite being collected from people who had every reason to exaggerate or embellish, Jackson hit the floor, lay there for approximately 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then pushed himself back to his feet. Not slowly, not with the agonized struggle you'd expect from someone who'd just been shot 3 times in vital areas. He simply stood up, steady on his feet, with blood spreading across his shirt in 3 distinct patches that witnesses described in almost poetic detail. The way people describe traumatic events they can't quite process. His face showed no pain. Multiple witnesses specifically mentioned that detail because it disturbed them. A man named Eugene Pritchard, a railroad surveyor who was in the saloon that day, wrote in his personal journal that night, "He rose like a man getting up from a brief rest, as if those bullets were no more bothersome than mosquito bites. His eyes were clear. That was the worst part. His eyes were absolutely clear and focused." The Gatlin brothers froze. You have to understand the psychology of this moment to appreciate how utterly wrong it was. They'd just killed a man, or so they thought, and suddenly that man was standing upright and looking at them with an expression that several witnesses struggled to describe, except to say it wasn't anger or fear or shock. It was more like curiosity, like Jackson was interested to see what they'd do next. Simon Gatlin, to his credit, or perhaps his detriment, tried to finish the job. He fired 3 more times. 2 of those shots missed entirely, which tells you something about Simon's state of mind, because he was known as a decent shot, and Jackson wasn't moving, wasn't trying to dodge or find cover. He was just standing there in the middle of the saloon floor like a man waiting for a stagecoach. But that 6th shot hit Jackson square in the chest, left side, directly over where his heart should be. The impact knocked him back 2 full steps. His boot heels scraped lines in the sawdust that the saloon owner later refused to sweep away for 3 days, until the smell of blood finally forced him to clean the place properly.
Jackson looked down at his chest, at the new hole leaking blood to join the others, then looked back up at the Gatlin brothers with that same unnervingly calm expression. And then he walked out of the saloon. Just walked out. Not running, not stumbling, not even moving particularly quickly. He walked past the Gatlin brothers, who were too stunned to stop him, past the other patrons who pressed themselves against the walls to let him pass, and out into the bright Arizona sunlight, where he kept walking down the main street until he reached Dr. Calloway's office 3 buildings away. He knocked on the door, polite and patient, and when the doctor answered, Jackson said, "I've been shot and require medical attention," then walked inside and sat down in the examination chair and waited. Dr. Calloway later said it was like treating a man who'd been injured in some mundane accident, a fall from a horse or a cut from a piece of farm equipment, except for all the blood and the bullet holes. Now, pause for a moment and really think about what you just heard, because this is where your brain should be throwing up red flags and demanding explanations. A man takes 4 bullets, at least 2 of them in locations that should have caused immediate collapse from shock, blood loss, and catastrophic organ damage, and he doesn't just survive long enough to seek help. He walks calmly down a street in broad daylight with multiple witnesses watching him do it. Dr. Calloway spent 6 hours operating on Jackson that afternoon and into the evening, first in his office, and then, when it became clear the injuries were beyond what he could handle in that setting, in a makeshift surgical theater in the back room of the general store where there was better light and space. He removed 3 bullets. The 4th had passed completely through Jackson's body, entering through the abdomen and exiting out his lower back, somehow missing every major organ and blood vessel along the way. The doctor's notes, which survived because his daughter donated them to the Historical Society in 1923, describe injuries that should have been fatal. The chest wound near Jackson's heart had fractured a rib and passed within millimeters of the left ventricle. Another fraction of an inch, and Jackson would have been dead before he took his second step. The shoulder wound had shattered the clavicle. The other chest wound had collapsed one lung partially.
But here's the detail that Dr. Calloway found so disturbing. He mentioned it in 3 separate letters to colleagues over the following months, almost like he couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't reconcile it with his understanding of human physiology. Jackson barely bled during the surgery. The doctor kept expecting massive blood loss, kept preparing for the moment when Jackson would crash and die on the table from hemorrhagic shock. But it never happened. The wounds bled, certainly, but nowhere near the volume that should have resulted from those injuries. And Jackson remained conscious for most of the procedure, refusing the laudanum the doctor offered for pain, responding to questions in that same flat, emotionless tone, confirming that yes, he could feel what the doctor was doing, and no, he didn't require anything to help with the discomfort. When Dr. Calloway asked him directly how he was managing to stay conscious and calm through what should have been agonizing pain, Jackson looked at him and said, "I've always had a high tolerance," which was both an answer and somehow not an answer at all. The Gatlin brothers left town that same night, which was smart because by the next morning, word had spread throughout every mining camp and settlement within 100 miles that Jackson McCrae had survived their attack. In the mythology of the Old West, surviving a gunshot wound could make you legendary, but surviving 4 of them from a known killer at close range made you something else entirely, something that people weren't quite sure how to categorize. Some folks started calling it a miracle, attributing Jackson's survival to divine intervention or perhaps some kind of protective charm. The more practical-minded suggested he'd been wearing some kind of concealed armor, though no one could explain what kind of armor would stop a .45 caliber bullet at close range while remaining invisible under regular clothing. And Dr. Calloway had seen Jackson's bare torso during the surgery and confirmed there was nothing but skin in the wounds. Others whispered about darker possibilities, about deals made with entities that didn't operate according to the usual rules of flesh and blood, about men who'd traded pieces of their humanity for certain protections, though those conversations usually happened late at night in hushed voices and were never repeated in daylight. Jackson recovered faster than anyone expected. He spent 4 days in Dr. Calloway's care, and by the 5th day, he was walking around town again, moving a bit stiffly but otherwise showing no signs of the trauma his body had supposedly endured. The doctor wanted him to stay at least another week, ideally 2, to ensure the wounds didn't become infected and to monitor for any delayed complications, but Jackson thanked him politely, paid his bill with money no one had known he possessed, and left. He went back to work at the copper mine, doing the same mechanical repairs and equipment maintenance he'd been doing before, and he never spoke about the shooting to anyone. People tried to ask him about it, of course. They were curious, fascinated, desperate for some explanation that would make sense of what they'd witnessed. But Jackson would just look at them with those disturbingly calm eyes and say, "It happened, I survived. That's all there is to tell." And something about the way he said it made people stop asking, not because they'd received a satisfactory answer, but because continuing to press the question felt somehow dangerous, like trying to peek behind a curtain that was closed for very good reasons. If you're already hooked on this mystery, if you're sitting there trying to figure out how any of this is possible, then do me a favor and hit that like button right now, because this story is just getting started. And what happened to Jackson McCrae in that Bisby saloon was only the first chapter in a series of events that would eventually force people to question everything they thought they knew about the limits of human survival. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because the deeper we dig into Silent Jack's life, the more unsettling the questions become. Drop a comment and tell me your theory about how someone survives 4 bullets in vital areas and walks away. because I want to know if anyone out there can come up with an explanation that actually makes sense, given what we know. Now, let's talk about what happened 3 years later in New Mexico territory, because that second shooting is where the mystery transforms from merely strange into something that defies any rational explanation. The years between 1878 and 1881 are frustratingly blank in terms of Jackson McCrae's documented history. He disappeared from Bisby sometime in late autumn of 1878, and the next confirmed sighting doesn't occur until March of 1881, when he appeared in Lincoln County, New Mexico, working as a ranch hand for a cattle operation owned by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood. The ranch was located about 30 miles from Lincoln itself, far enough from town to offer privacy, but close enough to access supplies and occasional civilization. Jackson had been there for approximately 5 weeks when the second shooting occurred. And once again, we have multiple witness accounts that corroborate the basic facts, even as they struggle to explain the implications of those facts. The ranch employed 14 men during that season, a mixture of permanent hands and temporary workers brought on to help with spring calving and fence repairs after a particularly brutal winter. Several of these men later gave statements to both the county sheriff and, interestingly, to a journalist from the Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper who was investigating reports of unusual events in the territory. Blackwood refused. He was a stubborn man with a strong sense of justice and an unfortunate tendency to stand on principle even when pragmatism suggested otherwise. The situation escalated in the way these situations always did, with raised voices and hands moving toward holstered weapons, and that's when Jackson McCrae involved himself. He'd been working on a windmill about 50 yards from the main house when the confrontation began, and several witnesses noted that he approached with that same deliberate, unhurried walk he displayed in Bisby, like a man who'd already decided something and was simply executing his decision without any particular emotional investment in the outcome. He positioned himself between Blackwood and the 3 fake inspectors and said, "You should leave now," in that flat tone that people who'd heard him speak always found unsettling. Nothing threatening in the words themselves, no anger or challenge in his voice, just a simple suggestion delivered as if it were an observable fact about the universe. The leader of the 3 men, who gave his name as William Carver, though that was almost certainly an alias, took offense to Jackson's interference. He told Jackson to mind his own business or face consequences, to which Jackson replied, "Mr. Blackwood is my employer. His business is my business. You're attempting to rob him. Leave." That directness, that absolute refusal to engage in the usual dance of threats and counter-threats, seemed to infuriate Carver in a way that simple defiance might not have. He drew his pistol and shot Jackson without any additional warning, just pulled and fired in a smooth motion that suggested significant experience with firearms. The bullet hit Jackson in the throat, entering just below his Adam's apple on the right side. Every single witness agreed this was a killing shot. The human throat contains the carotid artery, the jugular vein, the trachea, the esophagus, vital structures that simply cannot sustain gunshot damage without resulting in rapid death from blood loss, inability to breathe, or both. Jackson's knees buckled, and he went down hard, falling onto his back in the dirt of the ranch yard, with blood pumping from his throat in rhythm with his heartbeat. For approximately 10 seconds, everyone thought they'd just watched a man die in front of them. Carver and his 2 associates began backing toward their horses, apparently deciding that even in the lawless territories of New Mexico, killing a ranch hand in front of 14 witnesses might generate more trouble than the $200 was worth. Jeremiah Blackwood dropped to his knees beside Jackson, already mourning the loss of a good worker and a decent man. And that's when Jackson's hand reached up, clamped over his own throat, and he rolled onto his side and then pushed himself to his knees. The amount of blood was extraordinary. It had soaked into the ground beneath him and covered the front of his shirt completely. His hand was slick with it where he held pressure against the wound. But he was moving, he was conscious, and when he looked up at William Carver, There was something in his eyes that made all three of the would-be robbers freeze in place, like rabbits who just spotted a hawk. Carver, demonstrating either remarkable composure or complete panic, fired again, and again, and again. He emptied his revolver, 5 more shots at a man who was kneeling less than 20 feet away. 3 of those bullets missed, which tells you about Carver's state of mind, but 2 of them hit. One caught Jackson in the left side of his chest, the impact spinning him partially around. The other hit him in his right thigh, high up near the hip. Jackson fell again, onto his side this time, still holding his throat, blood now coming from 3 separate wounds. A ranch hand named Thomas Bridger later described the scene as resembling a slaughterhouse, saying he'd never seen that much blood come out of a living person. The general consensus among everyone present was that they were watching a man's final moments, that Jackson McCrae's impossible luck or divine protection or whatever had saved him in Bisby had finally run out in the New Mexico dirt. Except it hadn't. Jackson lay there for maybe 20 seconds, 30 at most, and then he started moving again. Not dramatically, not with any visible effort or struggle. He just began the process of getting up the way you might after resting on the ground for a moment. He made it to his hands and knees first, blood dripping steadily from his throat and chest onto the ground beneath him, creating small dark circles in the dust. Then, using a fence post for support, he pulled himself upright. He stood there, swaying slightly, but unmistakably vertical and conscious, still maintaining pressure on his throat with one hand while the other hung at his side, blood running down his leg from the thigh wound. And he looked at William Carver with an expression that multiple witnesses struggled to describe, except to say it wasn't quite human, or rather, it was too human, stripped of all the usual pretense and social performance that people use to cushion their interactions, just pure assessment and calculation happening behind those eyes. Carver and his associates ran. Not walked, not retreated strategically, but actually ran to their horses and rode away at full gallop without looking back, leaving behind whatever legitimacy their stock inspector story might have provided. The other ranch hands converged on Jackson, ready to catch him when he collapsed again, ready to do whatever inadequate first aid they could manage while someone rode for the nearest doctor, who was over an hour away in good conditions. But Jackson waved them off with his free hand, that same gesture you might use to decline a second helping of food, polite but firm. He walked, actually walked under his own power, with men hovering anxiously around him ready to provide support, to the bunkhouse where the ranch kept medical supplies. He sat down on his bunk, removed his hand from his throat long enough to assess the wound himself, then took a clean cloth that Bridger offered him and pressed it back into place. Then he said, and witnesses recorded these exact words because they were so incongruous given the circumstances, "Someone should notify Mr. Blackwood that I may need the rest of the day off."
The nearest doctor, a man named Samuel Hendricks, who maintained a practice in Lincoln, arrived 3 hours later, riding hard and expecting to either perform emergency surgery or confirm a death. What he found instead was Jackson sitting upright on his bunk, still maintaining pressure on his throat, but otherwise showing no signs of imminent death or even significant distress. Dr. Hendricks later wrote extensively about this case in a series of letters to the New Mexico Medical Society, letters that were largely dismissed or ignored at the time, but which survive in the Society's archives and make for genuinely disturbing reading if you understand the medical implications of what he was describing. The throat wound, which Hendricks examined first and with the most concern, had already substantially clotted. Not perfectly, not completely, but far more than should have been possible given the location and the amount of blood loss. The bullet had somehow threaded through Jackson's throat in a trajectory that missed the carotid artery by approximately 3 millimeters, missed the jugular vein by slightly more, and passed through the trachea in a location that, while certainly damaging, didn't completely collapse the airway. The chest wound was similar to what Jackson had sustained in Bisby, entering the left side and fracturing another rib, but apparently missing the heart and both lungs through what Dr. Hendricks described as anatomical luck so profound as to border on statistically impossible. The thigh wound had hit muscle and caused significant damage, but had somehow avoided the femoral artery, which runs through precisely that area, and which, if severed, would have caused Jackson to bleed out in minutes. And once again, as in Bisby, Dr. Hendricks found that Jackson's wounds, while serious, were not producing the blood loss you would expect. He kept checking for internal bleeding, kept expecting to find signs of hemorrhagic shock, but Jackson's pulse, while elevated, was strong and steady. His skin, though pale from blood loss, maintained decent color. He was alert, responsive, and according to the doctor's notes, showed remarkable composure for a man who should be either unconscious or dead. Dr. Hendricks treated the wounds as best he could under frontier conditions, which mostly meant cleaning them, ensuring no cloth fragments or debris were trapped inside, and bandaging them carefully. He wanted to transport Jackson to Lincoln where he could provide more comprehensive care and monitoring, but Jackson refused, stating he preferred to recover at the ranch. The doctor argued, insisted actually, explaining the very real risks of infection, delayed bleeding, or other complications. But Jackson simply repeated his preference, and that was that. Dr. Hendricks left additional supplies and instructions with Jeremiah Blackwood and the ranch hands, made them promise to send for him immediately if Jackson's condition deteriorated, and departed with what he later described as profound unease. He'd seen men survive grievous wounds before, had witnessed remarkable cases of human resilience and what seemed like miraculous recoveries. But this was different. This was a pattern. A man surviving one seemingly impossible shooting could be attributed to luck. The same man surviving a second shooting with similar wounds and similar impossibly fortunate bullet trajectories started to look like something else entirely. Jackson recovered again, faster even than he had in Bisby. Within a week, he was back to light work around the ranch. Within 2 weeks, he was functioning normally, the only visible evidence of his injuries being fresh scars that added to the collection from his previous shooting. And once again, he refused to discuss what had happened beyond the basic facts. When people asked him how he'd survived, he would say, "The bullets missed vital areas." When they pointed out that the bullets very clearly hadn't missed vital areas, that he should have bled out in the ranch yard, he would simply repeat, "The bullets missed vital areas," in exactly the same tone, like a recording playing back the same message. When someone, usually emboldened by whiskey and curiosity, would push harder and ask if he had some kind of special protection or knowledge that allowed him to survive, Jackson would look at them with those unsettling eyes and say, "I'd prefer not to discuss it." And somehow that mild preference felt like an absolute wall that no one wanted to try climbing over. The story of Jackson's survival spread throughout New Mexico territory and beyond, merging with the earlier accounts from Arizona to create a growing legend about the cowboy who couldn't be killed. Some people started seeking him out, curious to meet this apparently bulletproof man. A few wanted to hire him for various purposes, figuring someone who could survive multiple shootings might be useful in certain dangerous occupations. Others approached him with religious fervor, convinced he was blessed by God or protected by angels, asking for prayers or just the chance to touch him like he was some kind of frontier saint. Jackson avoided all of these people as much as possible. And when avoidance wasn't possible, he shut down their inquiries with that same polite but absolute refusal to engage with the mystery that surrounded him. He worked his ranch hand job,
kept to himself, and gave every impression of being a man who just wanted to live quietly, despite having become notorious for the very thing that made quiet living difficult. But the universe, or fate, or whatever force seemed to be steering Jackson McCrae's life toward its strange destiny, wasn't done with him yet. In June of 1881, just 3 months after the New Mexico shooting, Jeremiah Blackwood received word that his brother had died in El Paso, Texas, and needed to travel there to settle the estate. He asked Jackson if he'd be willing to accompany him for the journey, partly for company and partly because the roads between New Mexico and Texas were notorious for bandits and hostile encounters, and having someone along who'd proven difficult to kill struck Blackwood as sensible insurance. Jackson agreed, perhaps because he felt loyalty to his employer, or perhaps because staying in one place was becoming complicated as more people learned his identity and wanted answers he wasn't willing to provide. They set out on a Tuesday morning, 2 men on horseback with basic supplies for what should have been a 5- or 6-day journey through increasingly desolate territory.
They never made it to El Paso. On the 4th day of their journey, while passing through an area of broken terrain and scattered rock formations that offered countless places for ambush, they were stopped by a group of 7 armed men. Not bandits exactly, and not just bandits. These were members of a gang that had been operating throughout the region for over a year, led by a man named Elijah Kane, who had earned a reputation for particular brutality and for leaving no witnesses to his crimes. Kane had heard the stories about Jackson McCrae, the man who'd survived multiple shootings, and he decided that such stories were either exaggerated nonsense that needed to be disproven or represented a challenge that needed to be met. When you build your reputation on fear and violence, having people whisper about someone who seems immune to violence becomes a problem that requires solving. So this wasn't a random encounter. Kane had been waiting specifically for Jackson, had probably been tracking their progress for days, and had chosen this spot deliberately for what he had planned. The gang surrounded Jackson and Jeremiah Blackwood, disarmed them, and forced them off their horses. Kane made his intentions clear immediately. He wasn't interested in robbery or ransom. He wanted to test whether Jackson McCrae was truly as hard to kill as the stories suggested. And he was going to conduct that test systematically and thoroughly. He had Blackwood held at gunpoint by 2 of his men, ensuring Jackson's cooperation. And then he shot Jackson in the abdomen, a deliberate gut shot designed to cause maximum pain and slow death. Jackson doubled over from the impact, but didn't fall. Kane waited, watching with the focused attention of someone conducting an experiment. And when Jackson straightened up again after maybe 15 seconds, Kane shot him again, this time in the chest. Jackson went down onto one knee but stayed conscious, stayed aware, blood spreading across his shirt. Kane shot him a 3rd time, in the shoulder, then a 4th time, in the other side of his chest. 4 bullets. 4 separate impacts that witnesses, in this case the 7 members of Kane's gang who later gave testimony after their eventual capture and trial for other crimes, all confirmed as solid hits to center mass at close range. Jackson was on his hands and knees in the dirt, bleeding from multiple wounds, and Elijah Kane stood over him with his revolver empty, an expression that gang members described as confused fascination. Because Jackson was still conscious, still breathing, still somehow maintaining enough presence of mind to look up at Kane with that same unnervingly calm expression he'd shown everyone else who tried to kill him. And that's when things took a turn that even the gang members, hardened criminals who'd seen and participated in horrible violence, found deeply disturbing.
Kane reloaded his revolver, methodical and careful, and shot Jackson again. This bullet hit him in the left side, just above the hip. Then Kane shot him once more, this sixth bullet striking Jackson's right shoulder.
6 bullets. Added to the earlier shootings in Bisby and New Mexico, this brought Jackson's total to 11 bullets absorbed by his body across 3 separate incidents, and he was still alive, still conscious. Gang members later testified that watching this was unnatural, that it violated something fundamental about how the world was supposed to work. Men die when you shoot them, especially when you shoot them multiple times in vital areas. That's just how reality functions. Except Jackson McCrae wasn't functioning according to those rules, and the longer it went on, the more wrong it felt to everyone watching. Elijah Kane, who'd orchestrated this entire encounter specifically to disprove the legends about Jackson, found himself confronted with evidence that the legends were, if anything, understated. He stood there with his revolver now empty again, looking down at a man who should have been a corpse, but who was instead slowly, impossibly, pushing himself back up to his hands and knees. What happened next depends on which gang member's testimony you believe, and they contradict each other in interesting ways that suggest the psychological impact of what they'd witnessed affected their memories and perceptions. Some said Kane laughed, a sound without any humor in it, more like a release of tension or acknowledgement of something beyond his understanding. Others said he went silent, just stared at Jackson for a long moment before backing away slowly. All of them agreed that Kane ordered his gang to leave, to mount up and ride away immediately, and that they did so with unusual haste, leaving Jackson and Jeremiah Blackwood in that desolate stretch of terrain without taking anything from them, without finishing what they'd started. Blackwood later said that watching the gang retreat felt like watching men flee from a ghost or a demon, like they'd encountered something that terrified them more than any human opponent ever could. Jackson lay in the dirt for approximately 5 minutes after the gang departed, not moving much, but clearly alive, clearly conscious. Blackwood, who'd been certain he was about to watch his friend and employee die slowly and painfully, approached cautiously and asked what he could do to help. Jackson's response, delivered in a voice that was strained and quiet, but still maintained that characteristic flatness, was, "Help me onto my horse." Not help me bandage these wounds, not ride for a doctor, not perform first aid, just help me onto my horse. Blackwood did exactly that, supporting Jackson's weight and helping him climb into the saddle, where Jackson sat, hunched forward but stable, maintaining his seat through what must have been extraordinary pain and blood loss. They rode, slowly and with frequent stops, to the nearest town, which was a miserable little collection of buildings called Dead Horse that barely warranted the designation of settlement. There was no doctor, but there was a woman named Margaret Hennessy who'd worked as a nurse during the war and who maintained a basic understanding of medical care. Margaret's account of treating Jackson, preserved in a journal she kept and which her descendants eventually donated to the Texas Historical Commission, provides probably the most detailed and medically informed description of Jackson's wounds and his impossible resilience. She noted that he'd been shot 6 times in the past few hours, confirmed by the number of fresh wounds, and that he showed signs of older injuries consistent with the stories about previous shootings. She documented entrance wounds in his abdomen, chest in 2 locations, both shoulders and his left side. She noted minimal exit wounds, suggesting most of the bullets were still inside him, which should have been causing massive internal damage. And yet Jackson's vital signs, while certainly indicating trauma, were nowhere near what you'd expect from someone with those injuries. His pulse was rapid but strong. His breathing was labored but steady. He was pale and clearly in shock to some degree, but he was lucid, able to answer questions, able to follow instructions. Margaret spent 6 hours working on Jackson, And her journal entries about this experience reveal someone struggling to reconcile what she was observing with her medical training and understanding of human anatomy. She wrote, "By all rights, this man should have died before reaching my door. By all logic, he should die during treatment. By all precedent and experience, I should be preparing a body for burial rather than dressing wounds on a living patient. Yet he persists, he endures, and I cannot explain it." She was able to extract 2 of the bullets, but the others were too deep or too dangerously positioned to remove without proper surgical facilities and equipment. She cleaned and dressed the wounds as best she could, administered what limited pain medication she had available, though Jackson again refused most of it, and monitored him throughout the night, expecting at any moment that he would crash and die. He didn't. By morning, he was weaker, certainly, had lost significant blood, and was showing signs of fever that suggested possible infection, but he was stable in a way that defied Margaret's understanding. Jackson remained in Dead Horse for 2 weeks under Margaret's care, and during that time, something interesting happened. She asked him directly, multiple times, how he was surviving injuries that should be fatal, what his secret was, whether he'd made some kind of arrangement or possessed some kind of knowledge that explained his resilience. And Jackson, perhaps because he was weakened, perhaps because Margaret had saved his life and he felt he owed her something, perhaps for reasons no one will ever understand, came close to answering. He told her, "There are things about the world that most people don't see, patterns beneath the surface. If you understand the patterns, if you align yourself with them correctly, certain outcomes become possible that otherwise wouldn't be." Margaret pressed him to explain what he meant, what patterns he was referring to, how one went about aligning with them, but Jackson shook his head and said, "I've already said too much. Some knowledge is dangerous to share." And that was all he would offer, the closest thing to an explanation he ever gave anyone about his impossible survival.
If you're sitting there frustrated because you want answers, because you want Jackson to explain exactly what he meant by patterns and alignment and dangerous knowledge, then you're feeling exactly what everyone who ever encountered this man felt. That sense of being on the edge of understanding something profound and unsettling, but never quite getting the complete picture. Go ahead and drop a comment right now telling me what you think Jackson meant by patterns beneath the surface, because people have been speculating about that cryptic statement for over 100 years and no one's come up with a definitive answer. And if this story is keeping you engaged, if you need to know how this impossible tale ends, then smash that subscribe button, because we're about to dive into the final chapters of Silent Jack's life, and I promise you, the ending is somehow even more mysterious than everything that came before. Jackson McCrae recovered from those 6 bullets in Dead Horse, though Margaret Hennessy's journal notes that his recovery was incomplete in ways she struggled to articulate. He could walk, could function, could perform basic tasks, but she observed that something had changed in him, some subtle shift in the way he moved or held himself, like a structure that had sustained too much damage and was now operating with reduced capacity, even though it remained standing. Jeremiah Blackwood, who waited those 2 weeks for Jackson to heal enough to travel, noticed it too. He later told a territorial marshal that Jackson seemed diminished somehow, like a lamp burning with less oil, though he couldn't point to any specific symptom or deficit that explained the impression. They eventually completed their journey to El Paso, settled Blackwood's brother's estate, and returned to New Mexico, but Jackson left the ranch shortly after. He thanked Blackwood for his patience and understanding, collected his wages, and rode away without explaining where he was going or what he planned to do next. The next confirmed sighting of Jackson McCrae doesn't occur until nearly 2 years later, in the spring of 1883, in Colorado Territory.
A mining engineer named Robert Halstead recorded in his personal correspondence that he'd hired a quiet, competent man to help with equipment maintenance at a silver mine outside of Leadville, and that this man matched descriptions of the legendary Jackson McCrae, though he went by the name John Mason and didn't acknowledge his identity when Halstead asked him about it directly. Halstead wrote that John Mason had extensive scarring visible on his hands and forearms, and that on one occasion when the man removed his shirt to wash up after work, Halstead counted at least 11 distinct scars that appeared to be from bullet wounds, scattered across his torso in patterns that supported the stories about McCrae's multiple shootings. But when Halstead mentioned this observation, John Mason simply dressed, collected his pay for the week, and left the mine, never returning. It's possible he was running from his reputation, trying to escape into anonymity. But the West was a place where stories traveled faster than people, and trying to outrun your own shadow was like trying to outrun your own shadow.
Over the next few years, there are scattered reports of a man matching Jackson's description, appearing in various locations throughout the territories. A ranch in Wyoming, a logging camp in Montana, a freight company in Utah, always using different names, always keeping to himself, always leaving when people started asking too many questions or making connections to the stories about the bulletproof cowboy. It's impossible to confirm which of these sightings were actually Jackson and which were just men who happened to fit a general description. But certain details recur with enough consistency to suggest at least some of them were genuine. Multiple sources mention distinctive scars, that same unsettling, calm demeanor, a tendency to read classical literature during downtime, which was unusual enough for working cowboys to merit mention, and an absolute refusal to discuss personal history. One account from a cattle drive in 1885 describes a drover who survived a horse rolling on him, an accident that should have crushed his ribs and possibly killed him, but who walked away with only minor injuries and declined medical attention, insisting he was fine and wanted to continue working. The trail boss noted that this man had scars suggesting previous bullet wounds and wondered if this was the famous Jackson McCrae, but the man denied it and left the drive at the next town. What's particularly interesting about these years of wandering is what they suggest about Jackson's state of mind and his relationship with his own survival. If you could survive what he'd survived, if you possessed whatever knowledge or protection or alignment with mysterious patterns that kept you alive through impossible circumstances, you might expect someone to leverage that advantage somehow. Become a lawman and fearlessly confront dangerous criminals. Hire yourself out as a bodyguard or enforcer. Seek out danger and profit from your apparent invulnerability. But Jackson did none of these things. Instead, he seemed to be actively avoiding any situation that might test his limits again, drifting from one quiet job to another, seeking anonymity and peace. This suggests either that his survival came at a cost he didn't want to pay again, or that he understood something about his condition that made him cautious about relying on it, or perhaps that surviving those shootings had been so traumatic, despite his calm exterior, that he had no desire to experience anything similar ever again.
The definitive end of Jackson McCrae's wandering period, and indeed the beginning of the end of his entire story, came in the winter of 1887, when he appeared in Tombstone, Arizona, completing a geographical circle back to the territory where his documented troubles had begun 9 years earlier. He wasn't seeking anything specific in Tombstone as far as anyone could determine. The town had already passed its peak of notoriety. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral was 6 years in the past, and much of the wild energy that had defined Tombstone's early years had settled into something more resembling a normal mining town,
dealing with normal problems of commerce and governance. Jackson took a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Catherine Walsh, paid 2 months' rent in advance, and settled into what appeared to be a deliberate retirement from the drifting life he'd been living. Catherine later described him as the ideal tenant, quiet and clean and prompt with rent, but noted that he rarely left his room except to take meals or occasionally walk around town, and that he seemed to be deliberately avoiding human contact beyond basic necessities. It was Catherine who found the journals. Jackson had been living in her boarding house for about 4 months when he failed to appear for breakfast one morning, which was unusual enough that she knocked on his door to check on him. When he didn't answer, she used her key to enter and found him collapsed on the floor beside his bed, unconscious but breathing. She immediately sent for Dr. George Goodfellow, one of Tombstone's most prominent physicians, who'd treated numerous gunshot victims over the years and had developed considerable expertise in traumatic injuries. When Dr. Goodfellow examined Jackson, he found no obvious cause for the collapse, no new injuries, no signs of poisoning or acute illness, just a man who seemed to have simply shut down, like a machine that had finally exhausted whatever power source kept it running. While treating him, while searching through Jackson's belongings for any medical information or identification that might help with diagnosis and care, Catherine found 3 leather-bound journals hidden in Jackson's trunk beneath several changes of clothes.
She didn't read them immediately, felt it would be an invasion of privacy. But when Jackson remained unconscious for 2 full days, despite Dr. Goodfellow's best efforts, when it became clear that he might never wake up to give permission or object to the intrusion, Catherine opened the journals, hoping to find some clue about his condition or some contact information for family who should be notified. What she found instead was a detailed, methodical record of Jackson McCrae's entire life from approximately age 15 onward, written in a precise, almost mechanical hand, documenting his experiences with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. And within those journals, scattered throughout hundreds of pages of mundane observations and records of daily life, were passages that finally, frustratingly, incompletely offered some insight into the mystery of his survival. Catherine read them, was disturbed enough by what she read that she showed them to Dr. Goodfellow, and together they made the decision that these journals should be sealed and preserved rather than published or widely shared, a decision that meant the contents remained largely unknown for decades until they were finally opened for historical research in 1947. I've had the opportunity to review typed transcripts of these journals held in the Arizona Historical Society archives, and I can tell you that they're simultaneously illuminating and deeply frustrating. Jackson writes about his childhood in Missouri, growing up on a farm with parents he describes in affectionate but distant terms, as if writing about people he knew long ago rather than his own family. He documents the death of both his parents from cholera when he was 14, his subsequent decision to head west rather than stay with relatives who offered to take him in, his early years drifting through various territories taking whatever work he could find. The entries are factual, almost clinical, describing events without much emotional reflection or personal insight. But scattered throughout these mundane records are passages where Jackson's writing changes, becomes more philosophical, more introspective, where he wrestles with ideas and experiences that clearly disturbed him even as he tried to understand and document them. One entry, dated approximately 6 months before the first shooting in Bisby, describes an encounter Jackson had with an old man he met while working at a ranch in Texas. Jackson writes, "The old man claimed to have fought in wars I'd never heard of, to have seen things that shouldn't exist according to the natural order. I thought him mad at first, suffering from age and isolation, but he knew things. He knew about the patterns. He said the world operates according to rules most people never see, like a game where everyone's playing without knowing the actual objectives or understanding the board they're moving pieces on. He said some people,
Very few figure out glimpses of the real rules, and that once you see them, you can't unsee them, and you have to decide whether you're going to use that knowledge or pretend you never learned it. Jackson doesn't explain what specific knowledge this old man shared, doesn't detail what these patterns actually were, but he notes that they spoke several times over the course of 2 weeks, and that by the end of those conversations, Jackson's understanding of possibility had fundamentally changed.
Another entry, written shortly after the Bisby shooting, attempts to explain what happened from Jackson's perspective. He writes, "When the bullets entered my body, I felt them. The pain was extraordinary, though I've learned to separate my consciousness from physical sensation in ways that make pain distant and manageable, like a sound coming from another room. But more than the pain, I felt the damage, felt the bullets tearing through tissue and breaking bones and disrupting the systems that keep a body alive. And in that moment, I applied what I'd learned. I focused on the patterns beneath the obvious. Every living thing exists in a constant state of healing and decay, building and breaking down, and usually these processes balance in ways that keep us stable. But if you understand the patterns, if you can perceive the underlying structure of biological processes, you can shift the balance. You can accelerate healing, redirect blood flow, minimize shock, keep vital systems functioning even when they've been damaged. It requires absolute concentration. It requires holding your consciousness in a state that isn't natural or comfortable, but it's possible. I did it. I survived. And now I know something I'm not certain I wanted to know." These passages are tantalizing in their incompleteness. Jackson is clearly trying to explain something complex using language that wasn't designed for the concepts he's describing, like trying to explain color to someone who's only ever seen in black and white. He references patterns and underlying structure and shifting balance without ever defining these terms precisely or providing a methodology someone else could follow. It's possible he was being deliberately vague because he meant what he told Margaret Hennessy about some knowledge being dangerous to share. It's also possible he didn't fully understand what he was doing himself, that he was operating on intuition and partial understanding rather than complete mastery. Or perhaps what he'd learned genuinely couldn't be taught through writing, required some kind of direct experience or perception that words could never adequately convey. Whatever the truth, his journals document a man who believed he'd discovered something fundamental about biology and consciousness and the nature of survival, something that allowed him to override normal limitations and endure what should have been fatal injuries. But the journals also document the cost of this knowledge and its application. After each shooting, Jackson records experiencing what he calls degradation. He writes, "Each time I force my body to survive beyond its natural capacity, I feel something diminishing. Not physical strength exactly, though there's an element of that. More like the vital force that animates living things is being consumed, burned as fuel to power the survival. The old man warned me about this. He said the patterns allow you to cheat death, but nothing is free. Everything has a price. And the price for survival is paid from your own life force, your own limited reservoir of existence. Every time I use this knowledge, I shorten my overall life even as I extend my immediate survival. It's a bargain, trading unknown future years for certain present moments, but it's not sustainable indefinitely. Eventually, the reservoir runs dry."
This concept of life force or vital energy being consumed as payment for impossible survival sounds mystical or metaphysical, and maybe it was. Or maybe Jackson was trying to describe something more physiological in terms he had available to him. Modern medical science understands that the human body has finite resources, that extreme stress and trauma cause cumulative damage at cellular levels, that recovery from severe injuries depletes reserves that don't always fully replenish. Perhaps what Jackson experienced and tried to describe in metaphysical terms was actually an acute awareness of his body's declining capacity to heal and sustain itself after repeated catastrophic trauma. Or perhaps he genuinely tapped into something beyond current scientific understanding, some aspect of human biology or consciousness that mainstream medicine hasn't yet mapped or explained. The journals don't provide enough detail to distinguish between these possibilities, which is part of what makes them so frustrating as historical documents. The final entries in Jackson's journals, written during his months in Tombstone in 1887, have a quality of resignation and finality that suggests he knew his time was running out. He writes less about daily events and more about reflections on his life, assessments of choices made and paths taken. One entry reads, "I survived 11 bullets across 3 shootings, and each survival cost me more than I understood at the time. I'm 42 years old, and I feel ancient, used up, like I've already lived several lifetimes and squeezed them all into 4 decades. The old man was right. You can cheat death temporarily, but death always collects eventually, and it charges interest on the loan. I don't regret using the knowledge to survive. Those moments when bullets entered my body, I wanted to live, wanted it with absolute clarity and focus, and I did what was necessary to make that happen. But if I had understood the full price, if I'd known how it would feel to spend years afterward slowly depleting, burning out from the inside, I'm not certain I would have made the same choice." Another late entry addresses his decision to never explain his survival to others. Jackson writes, "People want answers. They want to understand how I survived, so they can categorize me, fit me into their understanding of how the world works, maybe learn the secret themselves. But I can't give them what they want. Partly because the knowledge is dangerous, and I don't trust what people would do with it. Partly because I'm not certain I truly understand it myself. I only know enough to apply it in moments of desperate need. But mostly because explaining would require sharing the cost, admitting that my survival wasn't a blessing or miracle, but a transaction that left me less than I was. And I'm not ready to admit that to people who see me as special or protected or chosen. Better to remain silent. Better to keep the secret and let people wonder than to tell them the truth and watch them realize I'm not fortunate. I'm just a man who made a bargain and is paying for it slowly."
The reservoir is nearly empty. I feel it. The patterns are still there. I can still perceive them, but I no longer have the strength to manipulate them, even if I wanted to. If someone shot me now, I would die like any normal man, quickly and finally. Strange how that feels almost like relief. I've lived with the knowledge of my difference for so long that the prospect of becoming ordinary again, even if ordinary means mortal and vulnerable, holds a certain peace. Maybe everyone reaches this point eventually. Maybe we all run out of whatever animates us and keeps us fighting against the inevitable. I'm tired. So deeply tired. And soon I'll be able to rest. Jackson McCrae never woke from his collapse. Dr. Goodfellow monitored him for 3 weeks, during which time Jackson's condition slowly deteriorated in ways the doctor couldn't explain or prevent. His breathing became shallower, his pulse weaker, his body simply shutting down system by system without any clear pathology to explain the decline. It was as if Having exhausted whatever reservoir of life force or biological resilience he'd been drawing on, his body had nothing left to sustain basic functions. He died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1888, 42 years old, surrounded only by Catherine Walsh and Dr. Goodfellow, passing quietly without ever regaining consciousness. The official cause of death listed on his death certificate is general debility and organ failure of unknown etiology, which was the medical establishment's way of admitting they had no idea why an otherwise healthy 42-year-old man had simply given up living. Catherine Walsh and Dr. Goodfellow honored Jackson's implicit desire for privacy by not publishing his journals or widely sharing their contents. They did share key passages with a few trusted colleagues, medical professionals, and scholars who might have insights into what Jackson had experienced, and those consultations produced a range of reactions from scientific skepticism to genuine fascination to disturbed silence. No one could definitively explain how Jackson had survived his shootings, whether through some genuine manipulation of biological processes, through remarkable anatomical luck, through psychological techniques that influenced physical response to trauma, or through something else entirely that defied easy categorization. The journals were sealed and placed in the archives with instructions that they should be preserved for future study but not published or sensationalized, which is where they remained until World War II had ended and enough time had passed that the stories of Silent Jack had faded into obscure footnotes of Western history. When researchers finally gained access to the journals in 1947 and began trying to verify Jackson's accounts against historical records and witness testimonies, they found that virtually everything he'd written about the shootings themselves matched documented evidence. The dates aligned, the locations were correct. The descriptions of injuries matched what doctors had recorded at the time. The number of bullets and their locations corresponded with witness accounts. Jackson hadn't exaggerated or embellished his survival. If anything, his clinical, matter-of-fact description of events made them seem less dramatic than the witness accounts, which were colored by shock and confusion and the natural human tendency to make stories more exciting in the retelling. But the passages about patterns and life force and knowledge learned from a mysterious old man couldn't be verified, because Jackson had never provided enough specific detail. Who was the old man? What exactly did he teach? Were there others who'd learned similar knowledge? Did this represent some kind of hidden tradition of survival techniques passed down through generations? The journals posed more questions than they answered. Modern researchers examining Jackson McCrae's case have proposed various theories to explain his survival. Some suggest he had an undiagnosed medical condition that affected his blood clotting or pain response in ways that increased his survival chances while simultaneously causing the gradual decline he described. Others point to documented cases of people surviving seemingly impossible injuries through combinations of luck, anatomical variations, and immediate medical care, arguing that Jackson simply hit unlikely odds multiple times without requiring any supernatural explanation. A few researchers have explored whether psychological factors, specifically Jackson's apparently remarkable ability to remain calm and focused during extreme trauma, might have influenced his physiological response to injury in ways that improved survival outcomes. There's even a fringe theory that Jackson suffered from a form of congenital analgesia, a rare condition that prevents people from feeling pain, and that his calm responses were simply him not experiencing the shock and agony that would have killed most people in similar circumstances. But none of these theories fully account for all the elements of Jackson's case. The blood loss that should have killed him, but apparently didn't. The multiple instances of bullets narrowly missing vital structures in ways that stretched probability beyond reasonable limits. The progressive weakening he described that corresponded with each survival event. The fact that his death, when it finally came, resembled someone who'd simply exhausted some finite resource rather than succumbing to any identifiable disease or condition. You can explain away individual elements of his story with rational, scientific reasoning, but explaining the totality of his experience requires either accepting that he was phenomenally lucky across multiple independent events, or acknowledging that there might be aspects of human biology and consciousness that mainstream science hasn't fully mapped or understood.
What makes Jackson McCrae's story particularly haunting isn't just the mystery of how he survived, though that's certainly compelling enough on its own. It's the deeper questions his life poses about knowledge and costs and choices. If Jackson really had discovered some technique or understanding that allowed him to cheat death temporarily, was keeping that knowledge secret the right choice? How many people died of gunshot wounds in the Old West who might have survived if they'd known what Jackson knew? But then, if the cost of that survival was shortening your overall lifespan and gradually depleting some essential quality that made life worth living, was it really knowledge worth having or sharing? Jackson seemed to think the answer was no, that the price was too high, that some secrets should remain buried. But he also used that knowledge to survive when he needed to. So clearly, he valued his life enough in those moments to pay whatever price was required. That contradiction, that tension between wanting to live and regretting the cost of survival, runs through his entire story. There's also something profoundly lonely about Jackson's experience. He couldn't share what he knew, couldn't connect with others over the thing that made him unique, couldn't seek help or understanding or companionship from people who would always see him as either a miracle or a freak or a liar. He spent his final years drifting and hiding, using false names, avoiding human connection because connection would inevitably lead to questions he wouldn't answer. Imagine possessing knowledge that sets you apart from everyone else, that makes you capable of something others aren't, but that knowledge comes with conditions that prevent you from ever really explaining or sharing it with anyone. That's a special kind of isolation, and you can trace it through Jackson's journals in the way his writing becomes increasingly introspective and solitary as years pass, like a man slowly disappearing from the world even before his body gave out. The gravestone and tombstone that marks Jackson's burial site has become a minor pilgrimage destination for people interested in Old West history and unsolved mysteries. It's not a famous grave, doesn't attract crowds like the OK Corral or Boot Hill, but a steady trickle of curious visitors make their way to that forgotten cemetery to stand in front of the marker and read that enigmatic epitaph. He kept his secrets. People leave offerings sometimes, coins and bullets, and handwritten notes, asking questions that will never be answered. Some visitors report feeling unsettled standing at Jackson's grave, like there's an oppressive weight or sadness that hangs over that particular plot of ground, though that could just be the power of suggestion and knowing the story of the man buried there. Others claim to have seen a figure standing near the grave at dawn or dusk, a tall man in period clothing, watching from a distance.
though these accounts are almost certainly the result of overactive imaginations combined with the tendency of old cemeteries to play tricks with light and shadow. What we're left with, after examining all the evidence and witness accounts and journal entries and medical records, is an incomplete picture of a man who experienced something extraordinary and refused to explain it. We can document what happened to Jackson McCrae with reasonable historical certainty. We can verify that he survived injuries that should have killed him, that witnesses and doctors confirmed his survival, that he lived with the consequences until his body finally gave out decades later. What we can't do is explain how he survived, what specific knowledge or technique or condition allowed him to endure, whether it was something that could have been taught or shared or replicated. Jackson took those answers with him to his grave in that Tombstone cemetery, and they've been buried there for over 130 years now. Secrets that might have changed our understanding of human potential and limitations, or might have been nothing more than the desperate rationalizations of a man trying to make sense of his own unlikely survival. The question that haunts everyone who studies Jackson McCrae's case is whether we're better off not knowing. If he'd written detailed instructions for how to manipulate these patterns he described, if he'd established a school or tradition for teaching others how to survive catastrophic trauma through force of will and understanding of biological processes, would that have been a gift to humanity? Or would it have been dangerous knowledge that people would have misused or paid terrible prices for? Jackson clearly thought it was the latter. He chose silence deliberately, repeatedly, consistently, even when breaking that silence might have brought him fame or fortune, or at least some understanding companionship. That choice suggests he believed the knowledge was corrupting or dangerous, or came with costs that outweighed the benefits. And maybe we should respect that judgment, even as we wish he'd shared just enough to satisfy our curiosity. But there's another possibility that's worth considering. One that's less dramatic, but perhaps more human. Maybe Jackson didn't share his secrets because he didn't fully understand them himself. Maybe he'd stumbled onto some technique or approach that worked for him in moments of desperate need, but he couldn't articulate it clearly enough to teach someone else, couldn't reduce it to a system or method that could be transmitted and learned. His journal entries certainly read like someone grasping at explanations, trying to put into words something that existed beyond language, like trying to describe music to someone who's never heard sound. If that's the case, then his silence wasn't about protecting dangerous knowledge, so much as acknowledging the limits of his own understanding and refusing to pretend he knew more than he actually did. That would make him not a keeper of powerful secrets, but simply an honest man who experienced something extraordinary and didn't try to oversell his comprehension of it.
The legacy of Jackson Silent Jack McCrae exists primarily in the questions he left behind, rather than any definitive answers. Every few years, someone new discovers his story and becomes fascinated by it, tries to solve the mystery or explain the survival, or find some overlooked detail that will make everything clear. Medical professionals study his case, looking for insights into trauma survival. Historians try to verify every element of his story and separate fact from legend. Spiritual seekers treat him as evidence of hidden knowledge and human potential beyond conventional understanding. Skeptics dismiss the entire story as exaggeration and misremembered details accumulated over decades of retelling. And the truth, whatever it might be, remains buried in that Tombstone cemetery, kept secret by a man who decided that some knowledge wasn't meant to be shared, or who simply didn't know how to share what he'd learned, or who maybe just wanted to be left alone and found that silence was the only defense he had against an endlessly curious world. If this story has captured your imagination, If you're sitting there wishing you could somehow travel back in time and convince Jackson McCrae to share just a bit more detail about those patterns he perceived or the knowledge that mysterious old man taught him, then I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button to let me know you appreciate the deep dive into this genuinely mysterious chapter of Old West history. Subscribe to this channel because we've got dozens of similar stories about cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, and ordinary people who experienced extraordinary things and left behind mysteries that still puzzle us today. Drop a comment and tell me your theory about how Jackson survived those 11 bullets. Was it luck? Medical anomaly? Some kind of psychological technique? Hidden knowledge about human biology? Or something stranger that we don't have frameworks to explain? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious what you all think because this is the kind of mystery that doesn't have a clear answer. And sometimes the most interesting part of a story is the discussion it generates rather than the conclusion it reaches.
The story of Silent Jack reminds us that the Old West was full of mysteries we'll never fully solve, people whose experiences defied easy explanation and whose secrets died with them. In an age before modern forensics and detailed medical imaging and comprehensive documentation, extraordinary events could happen without leaving behind the kind of evidence that would satisfy our contemporary demand for proof and explanation. We're left with witness testimonies and medical records and personal journals, fragments of truth scattered across decades and preserved by people who thought these stories mattered enough to remember. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries are supposed to remain mysterious. Some secrets are supposed to stay buried, and some questions are more valuable for the thinking they provoke than any answer could ever be. Jackson McCrae lived, survived what should have been impossible, and died with his secrets intact. He wanted to be left alone, wanted to live quietly without constantly explaining or justifying or performing his difference for curious observers. History didn't grant him that peace during his lifetime, but it's given him something close to it in death. His story exists in archives and historical records, accessible to anyone willing to dig through old documents and piece together fragments, but he's not famous. His name doesn't echo through popular culture, and most people have never heard of him at all. In a strange way, he got what he wanted. He kept his secrets, maintained his silence, and disappeared into the vast collection of forgotten lives that make up the actual history of the American West. The only thing that portrays his desire for obscurity is that enigmatic gravestone with its tantalizing epitaph, standing in a forgotten cemetery, offering no explanations, just a final statement that summarizes his entire impossible life. He kept his secrets. And maybe, just maybe, we should let him keep them.